Hello, my name is Cameron Dillon, and this is my Arab 150 individual presentation. The topic I have chosen is the Israel-Palestine conflict. This week in our lecture, we discussed this conflict in just a small detail, so I'm going to attempt to explain the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the topics that I'm going to be touching on for this will be Palestine before the conflict began, what started the conflict, the battles and wars that have occurred because of it, and then finish off with the current relationship between Israel and Palestine at the moment. So, Palestine before the conflict. In the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled the area that is now known as Palestine. The population at that time was made up of 87% Muslims, 10% Christians, and 3% Jews. In Jerusalem, these religious populations were almost equal though. At this time, Palestine was a peaceful country and it contained many different religious groups, and they even interacted with each other at the time. So as we can see, the conflict has not always been in this country. So there had to have been some chain of events that brought us to where we are today. The start of the conflict. In the late 1800s, a journalist named Theodore Herzl witnessed the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and he concluded that the best solution would be the mass exodus of Jews to a state they could call their own. His movement slowly gained steam and became what is now known as Zionism. Herzl was elected president of the World Zionist Organization, and he spent years trying to obtain support for his cause for a separate Jewish state. The Balfour Declaration. So during World War I, British policy gradually warmed to Zionism, and it considered giving them a Jewish state. It was made official in 1917 in the form of a letter known as the Balfour Declaration, which was the first recognition of Zionist aims by a great power. This Balfour Declaration was a statement of British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was made in a letter from Arthur James Balfour, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time, to Lionel Walter Rothschild, who was the leader of the British Jewry. It's worth noting that at the same time, the British were making more deals with the same Palestine area with the French, which was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Arabs, which was the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. This is important because it kind of sticks with the Arab world, and we'll see that later. So the beginning tension. After this Balfour Declaration was published and became well known, there was resistance on both sides to it. The Palestinian resistance worried that Britain would honor the Balfour Declaration, and so this led to an Arab revolt, which was an uprising by Palestinian Arabs against British colonial rule as a demand for independence and opposition to mass Jewish immigration. The Palestinians were beginning to feel a sense of nationalism, so this was definitely something they were against, since it would it would not give them their state. The Jewish resistance, Zionist militias also engaged in terror attacks against Palestinians and British occupiers because they also wanted their own state without being ruled by another country. The most famous Jewish resistance would be the King David Hotel bombing in 1946. It was then the site of the British Mandate Authority of Palestine. It led to 91 casualties, with 28 Britons, 41 Arabs, and 17 Jews being killed. These situations led to the Jewish and the Palestinian population becoming further isolated and alienated from each other. The UN Mandate. In 1947, the British decided to hand over the Palestine colony to the newly founded UN so they could resolve the land issue that they got the area involved in. The UN ended up voting for an allocation of 55% of Palestine to be a Jewish state and 45% of it to be a Palestine state. This led to the mandate being received very differently from both the Jewish community and Palestinians. The Jewish community felt that this was the creation of a safe haven from centuries of persecution in Europe. Israel would be then the new center of Jewish life, which was a long-sought opportunity for their self-determination. The Palestinians, on the other hand, thought of it as Europe giving away their own land to other Europeans to atone for European sins and then advance European aims. After the British withdrew in 1948, the Israel declared independence and sparked a region-wide war from 1947 to 1949. Even though the Arabs vastly outnumbered the Jews, the Jewish community were better armed, better funded, and better organized. This led to Israel controlling 78% of historic Palestine, and Jordan ruled the West Bank, and Egypt had control of the Gaza Strip. So the mandate was pretty much ignored, and Israel sought to obtain even more land than they were given. The Six-Day War. In June of '67, Israel launched a preemptive attack against Egypt after Egypt's president Nasser blockaded the Straits of Tiran and amassed troops in the Sinai. Jordan and Syria were drawn into the conflict as well. Eventually, Israel captured and occupied the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, and the Syrian Golan Heights. As you can see with the map on the right, Israel conquered all of the the lighter tan colors. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 242, which called for peace between Israel and its neighbors in exchange for Israel giving back the land it had acquired during this war. Negotiations, however, went nowhere on how to implement this resolution. Finally, 12 years later, in 1979, the Sinai was returned to Egypt under a separate peace deal. However, the Golan Heights and the Palestinian territories continued to be occupied by Israel. In 1987, the Palestinian population collectively rose up against Israel's repressive policies. The uprising, which became known as the First Intifada, was characterized by mass civil disobedience, general strikes, boycotts, refusals to pay taxes, and Palestinian youth throwing stones at Israel tanks and soldiers. This led to more than 1,100 Palestinians and 150 Israelis being killed in the ensuing 5 years, and tens of thousands of Palestinians were injured or arrested. This eventually shifted the view of Israel as the victim, and Palestine began to have a little bit more sympathy from other countries. Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat is an important figure in this conflict because he was the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And in 1988, they came to an agreement to recognize Israel and renounce terrorism. It was a historic compromise because it surrendered Palestinian claims to the 78% of historic Palestine, and they agreed to focus their aspirations for Palestinian statehood on the remaining 22%, which was the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Oslo Accords and the fallout. In 1993, Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords. It was the first time that Israelis and Palestinians publicly recognized each other as partners for negotiations toward peace, rather than enemies who might be defeated by force of arms. This arrangement was originally supposed to last for a 5-year period, during which Israel and the Palestinian Authority would engage in trust-building measures and negotiate final status issues such as East Jerusalem, refugees, borders, and settlements. Unfortunately, 2 years after this agreement, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, and his replacement, Netanyahu, opposed these accords. He rejected the idea of a Palestine state and intensified settlement building in the occupied territories. In the last 20 years, there have been attempts made to come to a resolution, but neither side can seem to agree on a settlement that both sides wouldn't be willing to establish. The years and decades of mistrust has affected the relationship. Currently, there are 350,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and over 200,000 in East Jerusalem. These settlements are considered illegal by international law. There's still ongoing warfare between the two sides and unresolved land issues. It's important that we understand each side going forward because it is such a complex issue, because both sides do have their own valid reasons. For the Palestinians, they have been denied a state since the British mandates and have basically been living under military occupation ever since. For the Jewish people, they need a homeland and were promised one, and must protect their nation.